of data in this isolated town up near the Arctic Circle in Sweden, which probably wasn't the most wonderful place to live, but is great for scientists because they all married each other. They're all the same religion. Nobody came in, nobody came out. They all knew when. There was great records about when they were born, who was born, who they were born to, what children they had, what they died from, and their kind of social history, if they had a famine that year, because they had to raise all their own food. So there was a guy who was looking at all of that information, just interested in his own history, and discovered something really striking, that if your grandmother was going through puberty during the severe famine, so there was a severe famine in the early 1900s, and where a lot of people died. And some of the people survived and have records of all of this. It turns out, if you look at people who are alive today, a lot of them say whose grandmother was going through puberty during that famine, or whose father had certain experiences in that time. Today, they often suffered from diabetes or died from metabolic diseases that had to do with eating. So that was strange and very striking, a very striking correlation between things that the grandmothers experienced at certain times in their lives, grandfathers, and 2 generations later, 1 and 2 generations later. So that's unusual because evolution doesn't happen nearly that fast. It happens over 20, in humans, 20, 30, 40 generations. So how could this experience of famine be correlated to metabolic diseases people are having a generation or 2 later? Okay, keep that story in mind. Number 2, a woman named Rachel Yehuda, who's a psychiatrist, was noticing over time that she was getting certain patients that seemed to be suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disease. You guys have probably heard of it. It's become part of the common vernacular. The weird thing about these people, a lot of them, was that they hadn't suffered any trauma themselves that they were aware of. But they had grandparents who'd gone through the Holocaust in World War II. So she figured, well, they must have heard, these kids must have heard awful stories from their grandparents. And that somehow passed on this trauma. And that's why they kind of were acting like they had PTSD, even that had gone through. No. A lot of them didn't even know until much later, when it was more easy for their grandparents to talk about. They didn't even know that their grandparents had been in the Holocaust, much less that they suffered. So, 2 weird stories where in 1 or 2 generations, effects have been passed on very quickly, which, and not in a genetic way that we would normally think of genes, say passing on eye color or passing on things like that. These were complicated things like post-traumatic stress syndrome and diabetes and other metabolic diseases. So people started wondering, what if there's something else going on? I mean, we know that the only thing we get from mom and dad, the only thing we get from dad is the sperm, some DNA, and then what we get from mom is the egg, plus a lot of stuff that mom has in that egg. So the thought was, well, something must be carried that remembers that experience somehow, or remembers that grandma suffered from the Holocaust, and somehow that information is getting to the grandkids, and it couldn't be in the genetic code itself. The genetic code does not change that fast. Well, this is interesting, because it was kind of, like I said, it went against what the normal way we think about evolution, and it was just kind of striking anyway if you start thinking about the implications of things like that, like stuff you do now, smoke, eat too much chocolate, whatever you do now, exercise a lot, that could affect your grandkids. That's not normally the way we think about that. So, what we do in science, because we can't ethically go and say, okay, well, you guys, we can't do experiments on you guys, right? We can go to animals. Well, at least in our culture. Some cultures, like Buddhist culture, they don't ethically do experiments on animals either, but in our culture, we're cool with doing experiments on mice and flies and other things like that. So, my friend Brian Diaz at Emory did the following cool experiment to kind of test this idea that your experience could affect your kids for your grandkids, outside or in addition to your DNA. So here's what he did. It was kind of a brilliant experiment that nobody believed the results to for a while. He took some mice or rats, I can't remember which. He took males just to make it easier in terms of pregnancy and taking out those variables. And he just gave them a little foot shock and a smell of cat urine at the same time. So every time these mice, of course mice are afraid of cats, and they're afraid of the smell in the urine. So you'd expose them to that smell and give them a little foot shock at the same time. And when you do that to mice, when you give them a little foot shock, they just freeze like this. Okay? Well, not surprisingly, because you guys probably remember Skinner and Pavlov and all those guys, not surprisingly, after a while, you could just give them the smell without the shock, and they would freeze as if they'd been shocked. You know, that's the classic thing like you do with your dog when you train your dog. Hey guys, come on in. Lisa, you want to set them up back there, maybe? Some chairs. So that part we knew because Pavlov, he'd ring the bell, and the dog would start salivating. He'd ring the bell with food, ring the bell with food, and then eventually you just ring the bell and salivate. You remember that stuff? Anyway, it wasn't too surprising that if you just kept doing that to mice, smell plus shock, after a while you just get the smell and act like they're shocked. Okay, nothing special there. So then he took those male mice and he mated them with female mice who'd never experienced any shock or smell, and he gets them. Okay? He mates them, and maybe I should draw some more. And he takes the offspring of those guys, he takes the offspring of the father that had this experience with the shock and the smell, and the mother who had no experience. He takes their pups, and he exposes them to the smell. They'd never smelled before, they're just newborn pups, and they act like they've been shocked. That doesn't make any sense, right? Not only that, since then, he's shown that if you take those guys and grow them up and make them to naive to females who've never experienced it again, look at their kids, expose them to the cat piss smell, they act like they've been shocked too. So you see how this relates to the famine and the Holocaust thing, right? Something, an experience that granddad or dad had, the shock and smell, is that experience or that sensitivity was passed on to the kids and the grandkids, even though they never experienced the shock or the smell before. They act like they've been shocked. So that was really puzzling. Good. There's no way that the DNA can change that fast. In fact, the reviewers of these articles didn't believe them and made them go back and make sure that the DNA hadn't changed. And it hadn't. So, does everybody kind of get that? That an experience was passed on, or a sensitivity to an experience or something. And that's weird. I mean, intuitively it's not weird because we all know people in our lives who have experiences. Usually we think of like addiction or some other thing. And then their kids are addicted and we say, oh, it must be genetic. Or they were addicts, so they had a really bad life, so that forced their kids to become addicts or something like that. So we kind of intuitively have seen that many times. What we didn't know is this piece of it that seems to be, it seemed kind of above genetics. It couldn't have been genetics because the genetics didn't change. There's no way genetics can change in 1 or 2 generations. So that's why we call it epi, that means above genetics. Because the genetics didn't change it. But that's what's being passed on, is the DNA. So somehow, something must have been backpacking, or is that the right word? Riding the back of the DNA, some kind of information that was related to having that smell and that shock at the same time. Somehow, the information of having experienced the awfulness of the Holocaust must have been passed on to their kids and grandkids. It wasn't in their DNA, but carried by their DNA maybe, above their genetic. So that kids and grandkids of Holocaust survivors acted like they had PTSD, but they never even had the trauma. Somehow, the experience of famine in those future grandmothers was passed on in the forms of having eating diseases like diabetes to their grandkids. That's epigenetics. And trying to figure all that out is what we've done in the 20 years since then. But I just want to make sure everybody's cool with the weirdness of that. And also the kind of implications, if you start thinking about that. That stuff we're doing, if you haven't had kids yet, or stuff you did if you haven't had grandkids yet, might somehow be sensitizing them. You may have already sensitized them. It's too late for grandkids or kids if you've already had them. Sensitizing them to certain kinds of experiences. Because we knew about the DNA part, but we didn't know about this extra DNA part. Yes, sir?
What do mice normally do when they smell cat?
They run away. Yeah, they run away. So here it was just a convenient test, you know, to match it up. This had already been done before, just to match it up with the shop, and then show that after a while. I think after 3 times, you just show the smell and act like the shop. So they start. So Brian and many others since then. So he finally got this published. It took him 3 years to publish it because scientists are really conservative and they hold on to their ideas even worse than anybody else. Ironically. It took them 3 years to publish this paper, and since then there's been a ton of work. And for example, they looked at those mice and they found out that the neurons involved in that smell in all 3 generations had grown excessively. So the first generation they grew because they were trained for the shop. You get a lot more neurons then. So it turns out they're cool. Mice have 1 neuron for a particular smell, per smell, so you can actually look at it and see it got a lot more of that when you train them, as you might expect. The weird thing was, their kids and grandkids were born with more of that neuron. So, not surprisingly, they would act certain ways when they smell it. So a lot more work has been done, and what we've kind of figured out, or a long way from understanding all of this, is that your experiences, some of them, we don't know exactly which ones, or does it have to be a certain intensity of experience. Your experiences that you have, and this is anything in your environment. Religion, ice cream, love, everything that happens to you in your cells. Anything, right? Could be food, could be having a pet, a relationship, learning how to knit, learning anything, experiencing trauma. That's what I mean by experience, environmental change or experience. That affects your genes, not surprisingly. You eat a sandwich, you want to turn on your genes. That help you make stuff to digest it, and then you want to turn them off. You get stressed out, you want to go into flight or fight response, and then you want to turn it off. You fall in love, well, you do all the stuff you fall in love with. I mean, it's not too surprising. It affects your genes by putting marks on them that control access. So it turns out that genes are really just kind of like a blueprint. So if I hand you a blueprint, it's not really doing anything. You have to hire all the contractors for your house and build and do a lot of work with that blueprint. It turns out that experiences kind of put marks on the blueprint that say, turn these genes on, turn these genes off. They kind of make that blueprint dynamic. Okay? And that happens to us every day. We wake up, certain genes turn on, so certain marks are there, and those genes are unmarked. They go back to the way they were. We were growing up. We developed from a single cell, and we get all different kinds of marks that allow our genes to do all different kinds of things. Right? So this is stuff we kind of knew was happening anyway. In fact, we kind of knew, story number 4 here, what we already knew, we kind of knew about epigenetics. Think about this. You've all known identical twins, right? Probably all known identical twins. Think about if you knew them when they were young and then later, and they grew up.